You're listening to the Business of Pharmacy podcast with me, your host, Mike Kelzer. Pramod, for those that haven't come across you online, introduce yourself and tell our listeners what we're talking about today.
My name is Pramod John, the CEO of VIVIO Health. We were started in 2016, and our focus is on this question of, hey, why do these drugs cost so much? And why do they seem like they aren't necessarily helping all the people that we're paying all of these high prices for?
Pramod, we got to start here. One of my sons just graduated from mechanical engineering. And when we were at his graduation, there were some people there in electrical engineering. And Brian said, those are the smart guys. He said, the ones that go into electrical are smarter than us mechanical ones. Now, I don't know if that's true, but you're a electrical engineer.
That's correct. I'm not going to make a claim of being smarter than anybody. I know some very bright mechanical engineers that are extremely smart. So
you're not biting on that one. I'll tell Brian that. He'll enjoy that. Pramod, electrical engineer, does that also have to do with the computer coding and that kind of stuff? Or is it truly just the electrical, the circuits and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, no, electrical engineering is very broad. It has very little to do with that traditional where it started out being electricity, for example, and magnetism, those types of things. And so my background was mostly did a lot of computational work, for example, did work in some basic physics, physical chemistry. So it could be all over the place in optics. So I've done work in all of those spaces. And so today it's a very broad space. It could include everything from basic sciences in some cases to designing computers, computer engineering, designing semiconductors. All of those things generally fall into aspects of EE nowadays.
How'd you end up then in the pharmacy field from that?
I didn't start out there. I started out in the computer security space. So I did a few ventures in the computer security space. And after those were sold, I felt that, going back to your question about smart or not smart, my issue was always that especially I live in Silicon Valley, and we seem to work on a lot of problems that make people a lot of money. But those don't seem to be the problems that really drive the biggest problems that we have in society. For example, education, healthcare, government, these types of big systems problems aren't the ones that we're focused on. And so after being in the computer security space, I decided that healthcare was our biggest national social problem affecting our economy. And I wanted to do something about changing the healthcare system. And that's how I ended up going into healthcare. And I started out my career in healthcare at a company called McKesson, which is one of the largest healthcare companies in the world. And it was one of those fascinating experiences because I went in with a lot of people who go into healthcare, especially as outsiders. They're thinking, I know all about software and everything else. This is going to be an easy thing. They just need more software, computers, and technology. It's going to fix all their problems. And of course, that's a very short-sighted and uneducated opinion. And working at McKesson was one of those experiences of everything you thought about the way the healthcare system worked was wrong, type of experience. And it was how money flows and how the system works. It's not a technology problem. It's how these large scale systems work and how money and the economics behind these systems are ultimately what drive what they do. Our healthcare system doesn't have a lack of technology. It's not a technology problem. It's not we just need smarter people from Silicon Valley. It's not one of those problems. It's a problem in which there are billions and trillions of dollars moving on a monthly, quarterly basis. And as a result, there are a lot of very interested parties. When I started out in healthcare, when I got into the space, it was about $2.5 trillion. Now we're at almost $4.5 trillion. And everybody thought that we could never make it past $2.5 trillion. And now we're not even blinking at $2.5 trillion and about 20% of GDP. And so there's this whole sense in which at some point, it's almost like we don't even care anymore because it's so big. We don't understand what we can do. And of course, the people who sell healthcare are all like, hey, we're doing a great job. We can't really do any better. And the people who pay for healthcare are perennially asking the questions of, why do we pay so much for all this stuff? And why are our metrics so much worse than the rest of the world? Here's a crazy factoid for you. The United States represents 4% of the world's population. If you look at our population divided by the total, we're 4%. So I never realized how small we were. We're only 4% of the world's population. Do you know that we spend as much on drugs as the rest of the world combined? 96% of the world's population pays exactly the same amount as we Americans do, representing only 4% of the world's population. We're not living longer. We don't have better outcomes. Our life expectancy has dropped post-COVID, opioid addiction, all those things that have happened that have been a result of drugs, as a matter of fact, unfortunately. But as a result of that same industry, we've seen in many ways our life expectancy actually drop, not catching up with the rest of the world. They're underdeveloped or third world countries that have higher life expectancies than the United States does. And we spend as much as all those countries put together in the world.
A lot of people would hear that number and say, that's crazy. We can do better than that. There's a handful of people, though, that hear that number and they say, we wish we were 97% of the healthcare costs because that's what helps our bottom line. What kind of people are saying that? Who does that 96% help the most? And I got to just think offhand, it's people that enjoy the arbitrage of higher costs, some PBMs, some politicians getting their palms greased, drug manufacturers, hospitals that maybe get more money the more heart transplants they do and so on. Who wants to keep that number up?
The healthcare industry. Look, if it's 20% of GDP, if you were just look at our GDP, and on a good day, the estimates or the number of people who work in the healthcare industry are about 4 to 5% or less of the US population. So if you go back and look at that, it means 95% of the US population is actually consolidating dollars that move to pay the 5% of the US population. And so imagine you're the average median income earner in the United States. You have the privilege of working 2 people times 1 or more minimum wage jobs just so that you can hit, median income in this country. So you can make sure that your kids have food on the table, they have the basic necessities in life. Look, median income, we're not talking about people who are living well in this country. We're not talking about middle class. And that's where the median income is. But if you look at where those dollars are coming from, it's dollars that those people should have had to be able to spend on the things that they want to versus being forced to spend it on healthcare, or their employers forced to spend 20 grand, 26 grand per family a year on healthcare compared to a 50 grand a year median salary in this country. You can make a strong argument that investment in healthcare actually drives up the cost of healthcare too. Because if you look at a lot of the investments that are coming out, private equity and others that are investing in healthcare, where remember that pot is growing, which is why everybody's investing. Nobody's investing in solutions that actually take dollars out of the healthcare system. And pretty much every business model is based on how do I move dollars from someone else's pocket into my own, whether that's another healthcare company's pocket into my own, or it's the consumer's pocket into my own, versus, hey, healthcare is a public trust. Unlike many other things, it's the public that pays for healthcare. If you're in a self-insured employer, your pooled funds pay for the employee sitting next to you. If you're fully insured, your funds are actually paying for the person who is next to you. And so these are all public funds that are being used. And today there is no sense of which we have a public responsibility around healthcare because it's a public trust. Rather, we treat healthcare as a public trust fund that we can help ourselves do, is really the way that it works today.
And I know, Pramod, that your company, and we don't see this a lot, especially in the heading, but your company is in fact a public benefit corporation. Tell me the genesis of that. Was that from the start, and why that versus a regular C Corp?
Yeah, I mean, we originally incorporated as a C Corp, and that was largely because there were still some questions about this public benefit status. Most states don't have such a thing as a public benefit corporation. Delaware, just not too long ago, actually put into place a Delaware public benefit corporation. A lot of companies, for a lot of reasons, are headquartered out of Delaware, as we are. And so the public benefit corporation piece was very important to us because it reflects who we are as a company and what we set out to do. Because our mission is to take dollars out of the healthcare system. So the way we measure our success is how many dollars have we taken out of the healthcare system. And one of the biggest problems that we have is that this is about money. And money is really about business models. It's about how do you make money? For example, if someone comes and cuts my lawn, it's pretty clear on what the exchange is. I pay the person, he cuts or she cuts my lawn. I'm happy. I pay somebody. There aren't any intermediaries involved, or if it's a company that I hire, for example, they pay their employees. And it's a very clear arbitrage on what we pay for and what we get out of the equation. Not only that, if I want to pay more, I expect more. If he asks me for more money, it's got to be that he has a legitimate reason or he has to do more work. He can't just come up to me or she can't come up to me and say, I just want you to pay me more. You're like, why? But in healthcare, that's not the way that it works. In healthcare, if you look at the way the system works today, almost everyone makes more money when prices go up and when more people use more healthcare. So as a result, if you have a business model in which you make more money by people consuming more, then I want people to consume more. It doesn't necessarily have to be good or better or anything. It just consume more. And in the same way, when you've got a lot of intermediaries, health plans, PBM, just the list goes on and on. Even providers. I was talking to somebody who was a physician last week. And if you look at what's happening, physicians used to be able to be an entity that could exist on their own, have a decent business, and none of them were making bazillions of dollars. They made decent money, but decent money is compared to other professions. They're not making a bazillion dollars compared to their neighbors. And today, it's very hard for a physician to be independent, that almost all the physician practices are being bought up by larger and larger systems. And remember, the physicians aren't necessarily making more money when this happens. Often they're making actually less money when this happens. But our cost of healthcare still is going up as the people who actually provide healthcare services are paid less. We go in and crank down. For example, imagine you're a rheumatologist. You get paid $100 for a visit and you barely have 5 minutes or 7 minutes to talk to somebody because your reimbursements have been cut down so much. But the drugs they prescribe have gone up from being $10,000 or $15,000 a year to $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. Nobody's complaining about that, but everybody thinks that doctor's making too much money. We need to crank it down from $100 to $95 next year.
Right.
And we're trying to save $5, $10 on the people who actually do the work. And the solutions that have in intermediaries have nothing to do with it. We're fine with them charging more and more.
Pramod, when I think about some of the people, as you talk about the money conversation going on, it always makes me think of like a car lot where you can put the lipstick on the pig however you want to by saying the new model is a bigger rebate and you're getting this invoice thing done and this warranty and this many features and so on. Though through all that, you're not going to walk out 2 years later less expensive than you are 2 years earlier. And when I think of all the money flying through the medical system, all these talk about costs and rebates and the vertical integration is going to save such and such. It's like when it gets down to the end of it, you can talk it all you want, but I think the key is what are we individuals offering up in payment? How much of our paycheck is going to health? And is grandma doing a little bit better that we can take her to the zoo? Or is the overall death rate going down? Those kind of things. And you can paint it any way you want to, but I think the truth of the matter is, and I know your company touches on this, is what does it mean to really decrease the costs? And it's easy to decrease the cost just by removing services, but what does it really mean to decrease the cost, but have an enjoyable life on the other side of it?
Why do we pay for healthcare at all? We pay for healthcare because we want to improve quality of life, like for grandma, to go back to your example of grandma or any of us. How do we improve our quality of life and how do we improve our life expectancy? Those are the two reasons why we pay for healthcare. If we didn't need to do that, then we wouldn't need to pay for healthcare. And so if we're to go back and ask, but then how should healthcare be measured? It has to be measured on how is it improving our quality of life and our life expectancy, because that's why we pay for healthcare. And today, for some odd reason, so much of healthcare, there is no tie to the question of how has that improved my quality of life or that patient's quality of life, or how has that improved their life expectancy? We have drugs that come out today which show zero benefit. Zero. We're not talking about some marginal benefit that we can't figure out. We have drugs that have been approved, like the Alzheimer's drug last year, Aduhelm. There was zero evidence of any benefit. It was a surrogate endpoint that this drug showed that it improved. And there was no correlation on that surrogate endpoint on whether it actually improved your quality of life or your life expectancy. And we were going to be paying billions of dollars for this drug. And the argument for why it should be approved was that hope is better than nothing. Okay. And that would be like going back to your car lot example, that all of us in America would be happy paying for cars that don't run. And we would justify it to ourselves because we have a car that won't start. And we went and paid full freight for that, saying that in one day we might have a car that runs. Therefore, let's pay for cars that don't run and fill our garages with them. Now you're laughing. I'm laughing. Everyone in America would look at that and say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Who would do something that stupid? Because that clearly is stupid and it's a joke. But in healthcare, for some reason, we pay billions of dollars for things that don't work. And we know that they don't work. And not only do we know that they don't work, on the Aduhelm case, the majority of the committee, the FDA committee, quit the physicians on it, saying this was the stupidest thing we've ever heard of. Because I forgot to mention another thing. If you look at side effects, remember, there's no zero-sum game of it's not free. When you take a lot of these drugs, it's the side effect cost that nobody's factoring in also, because technically you should have to weigh the benefit minus the side effects. Guess what? None of our models do that. In this case, about 30% of the people on the drug had severe side effects, including brain bleeds. And we approved that drug with no benefit whatsoever. And by the way, that story is not singular. I can give you example after example, primarily oncology drugs that have been approved that have shown no benefit. We're not talking about, does it give you 30 days of life or none of those questions. We're talking about none whatsoever. We have drugs. Not only that, about a year and a half ago, GAO came out with a study that was talking about drugs that had gotten accelerated approvals. And these were all oncology drugs. So accelerated approval basically means, hey, this shows some kind of promise. We're not really quite sure whether it does anything useful, but we're going to prove it anyway. So we all get to pay billions of dollars on an experiment. And in this case, just Medicare alone, if I remember my numbers correctly, it was something like $18 billion is what they spent over 3 years on drugs that failed in all confirmatory trials in the future. So these were drugs that were approved saying, hey, they may do something. And then there was never a confirmatory trial or a negative confirmatory trial, which proved the drug did nothing. And just on those drugs alone, just Medicare alone, spent $18 billion in 3 years.
Pramod, let's go back to the example of the Alzheimer's drug. And let's say you're in charge of the FDA or whatever. Let's say you've just taken charge of that over this quitting of the members of the board. What are you changing? And what happened there in the most blunt words? What happened on that board? And what are you going to do to change that?
So number one, let's go back to why does the FDA work in the way that it does? And so it turns out it's also a business model problem. And the business model starts with a lot of, you've probably heard this before about a lot of our regulatory agencies and how they work. It's about half the funding for the FDA comes from fees that are paid for by pharma. Okay. So who's your real customer here? It's pharma. It's not the American people.
Are there shenanigans going on, like if I do a favor for pharma, they are going to pay me more fees?
It's actually a really good question that you're asking, but it's slightly different. It is that take a look at most of the people who worked at the FDA and look at what their next stop is when they leave the FDA. Okay. And Scott Gottlieb lost no time at all before ending up on the board of Pfizer. And so you look at that and you get almost all of these folks end up going into industry. You can't piss off the hand that feeds you. And ultimately, it's not about wherever they're there. It's about they get extremely high paying jobs in lobbies and in pharma the day that you leave the FDA. And that's what happened. And all the pharma companies hire you because your job in life is to figure out how to get around the FDA now.
Pramod, is that what happened on the Alzheimer thing? Is it that simple that the people that remained on it had their future investment they were looking into? What else was there for this passage?
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. If you remember a few weeks ago, there was a new ALS drug that was approved. The committees inside the FDA that did the statistical analysis on this ALS drug from Sarepta Pharmaceuticals all said that there was no evidence that this drug did anything. And the person who heads up that division with the FDA, along with everyone on his own teams arguing that this drug showed no benefit, approved it with all of their disapproval. And this person has a record of the only other time he also went against every committee and approved it was also for another Sarepta Pharmaceuticals drug earlier. And you ask, how in our process can this type of thing occur? Because the people who are the regulators or in government are supposed to be economically disinterested people who ultimately represent the American people, not business interests within the country.
What's the answer to that question? Why is it happening?
Because we allow it to happen, and our system works that way. Our system doesn't have a restriction that says, hey, you can't go work in that industry.
I was going to say that it'd have to be like a lifetime non-compete kind of thing.
Exactly. It's got to be where you can't have an economic interest, or they need to bring in people who are dispassionate, who have no economic interest in the industry.
The FDA, for them to certify a drug, they have to certify that it's different. They don't have to certify that it's more effective than what we currently have. They have to look at safety, and it has to be different, but they'll give a patent to something even if it's not better. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. So the FDA has no objective standards on effectiveness, but it has standards on efficacy. Now, you probably hear that word all the time, efficacy, because everyone uses it. You hear physicians using it. You hear it on the radio all the time. It turns out that efficacy didn't mean what I thought it meant, because, of course, everybody uses that word all the time. I thought it meant what the drug actually does. It turns out that efficacy is the population response rate. That means how many people out of 100 got the response, or in clinical trial terms, endpoint that they were measuring. It does not have any statement about what the endpoint is. The endpoint could be completely worthless because the FDA does not have any standards on the endpoint. So going back to your thing, you know how we started out the conversation talking about something like Aduhelm? It turns out there are a lot of oncology drugs that look at what's called progression-free survival. And it sounds, if you listen to a term like that, it sounds reasonable. If a tumor is not growing, if it's not progressing, that must mean that it's good and that the cancer is not getting worse is what that means. It turns out that's not true. It turns out that in some cases, life expectancy can be correlated to progression-free survival. And it turns out in a lot of cases, it can't be, and there is no correlation, which means that even though the progression-free survival was positive, everybody died on the same day. And it didn't actually improve your life expectancy. And so then you've got to ask yourself the question of, look, if I'm going to die on the same day and something's not going to improve my overall survival, then isn't it better for me not to be on a drug? Because every drug has to be, take oncology, for example. There is not a drug that doesn't have severe side effects, right? That's a trade-off that you make when you have cancer, side effects. And so why would you put yourself on a drug with extreme side effects when it shows that it turns out that on the progression-free survival, it's positive? And one way to think about that is that it progresses more slowly, but then it progresses more fast and more quickly at the end, and you die on the same day. And at the end of the day, you died on the same day, and you had to go through all the extra side effects of the medication. Well, all of us would look at that and say, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But that's the world we live in, where the FDA can approve a drug on progression-free survival, saying it might help. And then we learn later that it didn't help, or that it actually harmed more people, in that it lowered life expectancy. And so all of those circumstances occur today because, again, that's the endpoint. So the endpoint is, I got better progression-free survival. That's effectiveness. What did the drug actually do? And efficacy is how many people out of 100 got that? What's the population response rate? So if you have 30% efficacy, that means 30 out of 100 people actually got to that endpoint, but it does not describe whether that endpoint itself was useful. So you can have drugs that sound great with high efficacy that are not meaningful at all and do nothing to improve your quality of life or life expectancy.
Let me see if I have this right, Pramod. So let's say with this Alzheimer's drug, it could be that the people that, let's say, certified it just to make it look good, they might have been measuring like some gray matter in this part of the brain or something like that, and they prove that this did such and such to that. But in the long run, maybe there's 4 or 5 different reasons for the Alzheimer's. And maybe even if you did cure this, everybody's going to get bad at the same point, and they can cook the figures up, but they may not mean anything in the real world.
And you brought it. So it turns out gray matter plaque was in fact, the amyloid plaque is in fact what the thesis was that by reducing that would actually reduce Alzheimer's, right? Now, that's a theory. It's never been proven. And not only is it a theory, there's more and more evidence to support that theory isn't even accurate or true. So how do you spend billions of dollars on unproven theories in which there's now not even strong evidence, not even mild evidence? The evidence is now leaning in the other direction toward it not being an adequate hypothesis to explain Alzheimer's disease.
All right. So Pramod, obviously the average person can't be thinking about this. I'm a pharmacist. I wouldn't even be able to follow this. It's hard to trust the government. It seems there has to be somebody that's not incentivized with this or correctly incentivized.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that's where VIVIO might step in.
Yeah. And so that's a really good point. And we started our discussion about business models and why they're important. One of the key things that we started out with is we charge a flat fee. So we don't actually care what drug somebody's on. It makes no difference to us. We don't get paid more or less. So whether someone's on 0 drugs or 50 drugs, or it's an expensive drug or a cheap drug, we don't care. We just care about the underlying data. And our job in life is to look at data. We care about data. And on top of that, we don't own anything. You know that you brought up vertical integration. So guess what's happened with all this vertical integration? So the people who control your money, who are supposed to represent you, the insurers, the PBMs, and all these people who are in this role, guess what they all started doing? They started buying service providers themselves. They bought hospitals, they bought pharmacies, they bought doctors, they bought everything else. And guess what? We put in these laws, like you probably heard of medical loss ratio. And so when the Affordable Care Act came out, we put in requirements that for every dollar you collect, you can't just spend all of it on administrative expenses and yourself. And as a result, everybody who's at any scale has to have at least an 85% MLR, which means that for every dollar you bring in, you have to spend at least 85 cents on actual services. You only have 15%, 15 cents on the dollar left for your profit or your fees or whatever else. So everybody got really smart and they decided that's dumb. So how do you get around that? You pay yourself because of the 85 cents on the dollar. So for example, you're a health plan, you buy your own doctor and you pay that doctor, you pay whatever you want because you're insourced it to yourself, or you're a PBM, you buy your own pharmacies and you pay yourself. And now you get around the MLR requirements because you can pay yourself whatever you want. There are no restrictions on it. And so our laws are antiquated when it looks at these things like, what was the point of an MLR? It's to prevent a vendor from controlling those dollars directly. And one could argue that, hey, if it's dependent organizations that you own, they have 100% control over that. You've broken the whole model by doing that. So vertical integration is killing us. And the other sort of analogous situation is that in the rest of the world, what's happened is that we've gone through cycles of centralization, decentralization. And now we've gone through this decentralization model and cycle. And what's happened in those cycles is that, for example, you were FedEx. FedEx owns a lot of things, including logistics, transportation, all these different pieces. And the reason you had to buy them was because of their scale. Nobody else could offer a solution without buying that vertically integrated solution. Now you can buy APIs where you can outsource your logistics to one party and its software, and the transportation is something else. And you can stitch together whatever kind of solution you want. You don't need to buy the one size fits all, and you can buy a solution that costs you less by stitching it together. But what's allowed us to stitch those together is access to data. Party who's paying for things owns, right? And they can access it and do whatever they want. In healthcare, we've gone the opposite direction. Not only are these institutions vertically integrated, they control the data. They control that you can't use any other third parties. They control all these things, which have gone exactly the opposite of pretty much everything else other than healthcare. And they've made the data inaccessible. They've made the data that, hey, we own the data. It's not your data. Your data on what you paid for that drug isn't yours. And we've done all these things that are exactly the opposite to insulate the system rather than saying, no, we want to open up the healthcare system so any willing provider of a service can now offer a better service. And now we allow data to be the underpinnings. By the way, the government has taken efforts like the health exchanges and things to do this. Go take a look at how they've been implemented. They built exchanges and there's nothing being exchanged. And you're like, why? Because there's no incentive to exchange and you've made it difficult to exchange. No consumer can go and say, hey, give me all my data today. I want it right now. Not available on the exchanges.
The exchange was, I've heard the word always, is that synonymous with exchange being competition so you can decide to do this or that? Is that what that word means?
That was the point of the exchanges. By opening up data, it'll increase competition. It'll increase choices for consumers by making their data available. So we built exchanges. But we never made the people who have the data, we never forced them to put their data on the exchange and make it available. So all it is, it's an exchange in which there's no traffic on because nobody can access anything through it because the laws did not require people to open up the data.
Pramod, is there any other industry even close to this? And let's just focus on federal funds because whatever self-insured this or that place wants to do with their money, maybe I'm not smart enough to understand it. But let's talk about federal funds where we're all paying into that. Is there any other industry that comes close to the smoke and mirrors and the non-exposure of their costs and so on back to the government who is funding this business?
No. And the easy way to convince yourself of that is ask yourself, what are the largest government paid institutions in the US the government pays for? Healthcare is number one on the list. The defense and all these things that we talk about are dwarfed. Education, dwarfed, right, by this. And so nothing else is even close.
So it's the biggest, so there's nothing close. But let's say everything was comparable. Let's say all these were equal distributions of funds. Healthcare, is that like far and above the smoke and mirrors, or is there any other industry that is as hidden as that is?
So it's a really interesting question because if you look at, so what are the most hidden industries in America? Government, it's a non-competitive industry, government. Education, non-competitive industry, again, education. And healthcare, at its core, it's a non-competitive industry. Everybody who tells you about competition in healthcare does not understand competition, how competition occurs or what competition means. These are largely non-competitive industries that we've created. Healthcare and education both could be more competitive if we want to change the structures on how they work. But today, we keep allowing these systems to work. It's like the PBMs have a safe harbor on rebates. We've granted them safe harbor that a rebate will not be considered a kickback. And now ask yourself a really simple question of, hold on, but why would someone be granted safe harbor? It's because by all definitions, it meets the definition of a kickback. And because it meets the definition of a kickback, we've said that you're special because you bring so much more benefit because of all the aggregation and the prices and all the things that you do. We're going to give you a safe harbor, so it's not really a kickback anymore. Ask yourself how ridiculous that is. And not only ask yourself how ridiculous that is, what are we having across the country now? Debates on PBMs, laws, restrictions, what they're doing. It's everybody's talking about it. Why do they still have a safe harbor for rebates when it's clear to every person on the planet who is not a PBM that this should be illegal? And it is illegal.
Pramod, as soon as you start talking about competition, and maybe you've convinced the legislators that there has to be balanced competition and so on, as soon as you do that, everybody tries to put up the smoke and mirrors again. You don't understand, Mrs. Senator, because, you know, this and this, and that's different than this and this. Where does the rubber hit the road of competition? Is there any place that you can compare apples to apples a little bit more than all this smoke and mirrors of policy and all that kind of stuff?
It's a really good question. I'll give you a really simple example of something that's been gaining a lot of attention in the public arena, which is Humira. It's a fascinating issue and case point around this whole question of competition. It's the biggest selling drug in all of history, biggest selling drug in the world annually currently, biggest selling drug in the United States. And so if you were to ask yourself, okay, let's just think about competition for a second. For something to be in that position, what would it take? In a competitive world, that would mean that it's got to be better and more cost effective than everything else. Assume that there was competition. Let's just for a second assume, okay, in a competitive world, what would that mean for this drug to be the biggest, best ever? That would mean that drug just blows everything else away. Okay, let me give you some facts. Humira is a drug that there have been many competitors to. It went off patent several years ago. We represent 4% of the world's population for which biosimilars or generic versions of it have not been available. They're available everywhere else. And it turns out that even if you took a condition like RA, take a rheumatoid arthritis, which is the first indication for which Humira was approved, there are already, before the biosimilars came out, there are already over a dozen different drugs, some of which are newer, some of which are better, some of which have better numbers, lower side effect profiles than Humira does, for example. And in real life, what ends up happening is that you realize that, hey, there are some drugs that are effective for different people. And as a result, you basically want more drugs because some different people respond to different drugs. And so if you go back and look at even Humira's numbers on its best day in its trials, it achieved in less than half the population. There was a mediocre response, less than half. And in about 25% of the population, there was actually a reasonably good response. In about 10% of the population, a great response. 1 out of 10 people is how this drug shaped up in the trials. And again, we can talk about the limitations of the trial itself, different conversation. But assuming those numbers, you're at about 10 to 25% that had a reasonable response out of the population. How could that drug become the biggest selling? That means that it didn't work for 75% of the people. That means that those 75% of the people still have something wrong with them, right, at this point, unless there are other medications that actually help them, which is what we'd expect. There are different mechanisms of action, different drugs, for example, that help those other people who weren't helped by Humira, for example. And so it turns out there are more than a dozen other drugs. Some cost less than Humira. Okay. In that world, how could Humira blow all of the other drugs put together pretty much away? There's no way that's possible other than market manipulation. Just do the simple math. It's not possible if it were in fact a competitive environment. So that goes back to the fact that that's how they won, is because the PBMs, Ambrol was the first drug in that space. And the second drug was Humira. Humira, and the folks who were back before AbbVie owned it, the folks there realized we'll just pay bigger rebates to the people in the middle. And that way they will put ours first. Think of it as grocery store shelf space. It's, hey, I put the ones who pay me the biggest rebates on the top of the shelf. But they went a step further. And they said that, and we won't even put other people's cereal on the shelf. And you can't buy other people's cereal. Okay. And that's what happened. And as a result, Humira ends up becoming the biggest selling drug in all of history, the one that drives most of the rebates. So then everyone's, oh no, what can we do? We have to wait until a biosimilar comes out because there's nothing we can do. We have no alternatives. Again, not factual, but that's the belief that people have. So Humira biosims finally, and by the way, I don't know if the reader or your listeners are familiar with this, but AbbVie threatened to sue all the biosimilar manufacturers. And so all the biosimilar manufacturers agreed not to sell for another couple of years, even after the patents expired, which should be illegal. It's anti-competitive. And that's what happened. And as a result, we had to wait for years after the rest of the world had the biosimilars available. And as of this July, finally, there was one biosim that was available earlier from Amgen. It was the first biosim available this year. And then July 1st was when the floodgates opened up, where all the other vendors and suppliers were allowed to bring their biosimilars. Now, you would expect that with the biosimilars that you're going to see a lot of change in cost. And let me give you a couple of examples of why you should legitimately expect this. If you were to look at Humira, it now has a list price of $80,000. It's actually a little higher than $80,000 a year. But now they have these big rebates that they pay the intermediaries and other things. And our estimates are net cost after the rebates. This is where you go to the employer, like, look, we're going to give you a big rebate. And everyone says, yes, I want that rebate and everything. I want it's bigger than my last rebate. Everyone's give me the rebate. They sign up. The net cost after all that on the best contracts that you can get in this country is about $35K, 30 to $35K. Okay. That's after the best rebates that you can get on a drug that started out like in north of 80. Okay. Yusimry is one of the new biosim alternatives that came out, and you may have heard about it. Yusimry through Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drugs is selling Yusimry at a discount, even for Yusimry. It's the lowest price available anywhere. It's just north of $500 and change, $600, okay? For 1 year of Yusimry, it's about just a little over $8,000 for a year of Yusimry, okay? For a year of Humira with the best rebates on the planet, starting out with an $85,000 drug, you're at $35,000. Okay. And it doesn't matter how you slice it, how good your consultant is, how your consultant can make up numbers in Excel, doesn't make any difference. You're not getting far from 35 versus $8,000, however you slice that. So any average American could look at that and say, $8,000? $35,000, even with all the smoke and rebates and everything else. It's not $8,000 on the other side for Humira. It doesn't matter how you slice and dice this equation. Okay. And if you look at AbbVie's earnings, you can also figure out it can't be $8,000. That doesn't make any sense with the amount of money that they're making, the doses that they sell. And so every average person, including every average politician in this country, should be able to look at that and say, look, I don't understand the whole healthcare system, but I understand $35,000 for this. I understand $8,000 for this. $8,000 is less. I don't have to be a math genius or be above kindergarten math to figure that out. That low-cost drug, Coherus from Coherus Biosciences, is not on any PBM's formulary. All the market expects it to get no demand and sell nothing, basically, is what the whole expectation of the market is. If that isn't broken, if that doesn't tell you that competition is broken in this country for things like basics, things like drugs, then nothing will. That's a kindergarten level example of why that's broken. Because if it were a competitive market, that drug would be flying off the shelves. It would be depressing the price of all the other people. And we would see a crush in the inflammation market on cost today.
A couple of years ago, we were about ready to lock our doors at the pharmacy because we were getting reimbursed from our brand name drugs, 90 cents on the dollar. So in a year's time, I'd lost like $250,000. So I was ready to lock the doors. So I said to myself, I made this decision like in 15 minutes. I said to myself, we either lock the doors because I don't have 10 grand tonight to lose 1,000 on it, or we just get rid of the brand names. And we got rid of all of our brand names. There's not many pharmacies, I think, that are doing this. And someday I'm hoping for someone to say, boy, Mike, you're wise. I'm not wise. I just know that it's better usually to have the business open than to lock the doors. That's my only wisdom I had. But the reason we've been able to stay afloat is because it's a very easy picture. Someone comes in and they say, why don't you have brand names? And I hold up my hand with the 5 digits and I say, the brand name of this is $500. And then I hold up one finger and I say, the generic, which we have, is $100. Wouldn't it make sense that Medicaid, the government and all that would want to pay $100 versus $500? And they say yes. And I say, that's not the case. They want me to sell you a drug for $500. And the people just start agreeing. They know what's going on. They know a slick sales play going on when they see it. There's no way you could not understand that, just like the Humira. It's like, you can say whatever you want to, but when it's 30 versus 8, there's no way to explain that away. Now, Pramod, how is that explained away? Is it because of the lobbyists? Is it because of people just, their eyes roll back in their head when these brokers keep talking to the HR of these big corporations? How are they able to keep this going?
I think, Mike, ultimately it boils down to we don't treat other people's money like our own, and we don't care about other people's money. Now, one of the differences about us is that we always talk about this in the company. It's like, hey, would we spend our own money on this? And that we always have these conversations, which are always couched in the, would we spend our own money? If we wouldn't, then why would we spend someone else's money in a way that we wouldn't spend our own money? And so if you go back and ask the question of, Mike, would you or any one of those people who walked into your store pay $500 at that point? They'd all look at that and it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I'm going to pay $100 because it's obvious. We've taken what's obvious and we've convinced people, right? There are all these people convincing the politicians, the lobbyists, saying that, for example, that rebates have helped more than they've harmed. That is a lie. That is nothing more than a dastardly lie because they're comparing the wrong things. Now, I'll give you an example of that. They look at that and say, Humira would have cost a lot more if we didn't have the rebates. And you're like, yeah, then Humira wouldn't have been the top choice that everyone's on. There would have been 5 other drugs in this country that people would have had access to that would have been on formulary, for example, and they would have had access to. So you're looking at the problem and analyzing it incorrectly rather than saying, yeah, we would have had a competitive market. Instead we say, yeah, but everybody needs to be on Humira and therefore it would have cost more. And so now what we ended up with was fewer choices in the market, a monopoly over a drug that is a so-so drug, instead of a thriving market in which a company like Coherus Biosciences can release a drug that costs literally a quarter of everything else, and everyone would be buying it instead of everyone saying, no, I still am going to buy the AbbVie one because I get a bigger rebate on it, even though I pay 4 times as much.
Pramod, now let me think this through a second. All right, so you go to companies and you tell them this story and You tell them, we're not making money on this. It's a flat fee. But let's say that then they go back to the top 3 PBMs. Does somehow that get changed, or do you then bring in other PBM options and so on for them? Where does the change take place, given that everybody is incentivized to keep doing things as they've been doing them?
So, I mean, I have to tell you, even though this is common sense, right? We're all having this conversation as common sense. If you're a politician in Washington, if you saw the price of Humira versus Humira, number one, you should be asking, I want to know what the net cost of Humira is. Until then, I'm not going to have a conversation with anybody. And at that point, why would you as a politician have a conversation about drug pricing without understanding drug pricing? So the first step would be get educated on drug pricing, how this stuff actually works, how much it actually costs. That'd be step number one. Step number two would be doing the common sense approach of saying, this drug is $8,000 a year and this drug is $35,000 a year. Common sense dictates that everybody should be on this drug. And at that point, you would be, how do we create our policies and change them to prefer the lower cost drugs? That's not what anybody's doing. And in the same way, we see the same sorts of things when we go to employers with the, hey, your problem is that your people are on the wrong drugs and you're overpaying for them. What you want to be able to say is no formulary. Your people should be able to access any drug they need. But every decision in life should be driven by objective data. It's not my opinion. It's not your opinion. It's not the doctor's opinion. It's not the patient's opinion. It's not pharma company's opinion. It's not the government's opinion. It's either there's data or there isn't. That's how the rest of our lives work. And if it's a great option for somebody, there should be data to support it. And if it isn't a great option, there's also data to support that it isn't a great option. That's how it should work, but it's not how it works. So in our world, that's how it works. But when we go to employers, we have a lot of customers who've carved their specialty out of the big 3 PBMs, all the major PBMs in this country. But what we're really saying is that, look, specialty is something different. It's a very small number of people who are on a very complex data problem. It's not like a torvastatin. Give away a torvastatin. Who cares? It's a couple bucks a script, $5 a script, for example, for a month. But when you're on an expensive drug on a complex condition, that's where you want to make sure, hey, is there data to support this? Is this the right patient for this drug? Is this patient benefiting from the drug? It's all about care. The cost is a secondary issue. And if you focused on care, you end up with lower costs. But I have to tell you, as obvious as this conversation is, the number of employers who immediately say, this is common sense, we should do this, is still significantly lower than you think. Because you know what happens? They go back to their consultants. Their consultants are all paid by the suppliers. They have their own coalition contracts. This whole game is rigged. And then the consultant has a spreadsheet which says, who's going to give a bigger rebate? And so imagine that drug for $8,000, which has a $0 rebate, and Humira, which has a $4,000 rebate. Which one should you buy? The $4,000 rebate sounds larger than zero.
All right. So Pramod, let me back up just a little bit. So if somebody does understand and they buy into the data, I heard that you said there are ways to carve that out. So let's leave that to the side. There are ways for this to happen. I'm curious, though, about these people, whether it's a CEO or HR head or something, that gets bamboozled into the broker's attempt to re-educate. Then what happens? Does that get under your skin?
Oh, it goes to to be fair, it's the system. It's not personal. It's not that broker. It's just the system. And everybody's been spreading disinformation, misinformation over and over again. And after a while, they believe it and they think it's facts. And those people who are talking about that $4,000 rebate versus zero, they truly believe that this is bigger. And they're right. 4,000 is bigger than zero, but they're asking the wrong question. And they don't understand the question they should be asking is, but how much do I spend on specialty in a year? I don't care what rebate or what drug or any of these things. I care about, did my people get the right outcomes? By the way, nobody's asking that question. No one collects outcomes assessments or anything. They don't know. They just pay for a drug. So number one, they don't actually know whether the drug does anything useful for the person and if so, what is it that's doing for them? And the second is they're overpaying because they're asking the wrong question. They're not putting them on the right drug. And what's worse is even that, like in the Humira example, they have limited formularies instead of a person having access to all the drugs that they might need. So it also limits competition. It prevents them from getting access to the drug they need, and they pay more. So on every action, this is pretty anti-common sense because we're common sense people.
So you do your job and you tell them all this. They go to their broker, and we're not going to crucify the broker because that's their job and so on. What happens then? Do you try to get a hold of these people again, or is it a lost cause because they've known their broker and probably played a few rounds of golf over the last 10 or 15 years and they trust you sort of, but you guys are newer to them than their broker?
You realize that why the whole CAA came about was because of that trust that is no longer really trustworthy. You don't need to create rules and laws to open up things if there was transparency and trust and actual fairness. When do laws come into place? Laws come into place when something is so freaking broken that we need to put a law into place. It doesn't come in at the beginning of, hey, we might have a problem, mission control. It has I think we lost the mission, we need to do something, is where the laws come in. So what does that tell you about where we are with broker compensation?
So is this part of the conversation that you have with people when they come back to you?
Technically, our world and our love is about the question of, do these drugs do something useful for this person? And is it a fair price? We just give them the information, but there are a lot of people for the first time asking those questions about, hey, what does CAA mean? Am I a fiduciary? Am I responsible? Let me ask you a question. If you're a benefits person, number one, should you know what the actual net cost of Humira is? Go back and do the same exercise. You probably can figure that out, or ask your broker, sure, hey, what's the net cost of Humira? Even with the best rebates, put in whatever you want. Doesn't matter. Put in any number you want of what you got for rebates and everything else. Then compare that to Humira. It doesn't matter how you compare. Humira is going to be cheaper. So at that point, does the employer have a fiduciary responsibility to require their PBM to make sure that everybody's on Humira? And if not, what does a CAA or fiduciary mean? What does fiduciary mean in that case of, yeah, it costs 4 times as much, but we still went ahead and did it. The broker told me to do.
I've had in my mind that you had a need to convince people, but your job is done once you share the information because you're not the salesperson for this $8,000 drug. You've done your job by explaining it to them, and that's where yours ends.
And our whole job is to make sure that happens for every patient, that they're on the right drug, it's the right cost, et cetera. And that's our job. But ultimately, what people are saying is that we don't care. We don't care that drug is $8,000 and all of our people are having to overpay. People who don't care.
So Pramod, is your service, I'm picturing two things. I'm picturing one is a yearly look at the formulary and this and that. The other service is actually dealing with individual employees or their families of this employer. Which one is that closer to what you do?
The second one, we have no formulary, so there's no issue with formulary. It's all about drug data. Our people, like our chief science officer, as I told you, was from Genentech drug discovery. So our whole focus is on understanding drugs better than anybody else on the planet. Because how can we help people? By understanding drugs better. And the party who understands drugs better than anyone else will be able to help more people.
Not that you have a desire for this, what other industry could this business model transfer to? Like, I know that it almost seems to me like you're an individualized consumer report for medical stuff. In the old days, I'd go, and now you do it online, but you'd buy the consumer report to find out your best double cassette tape deck and things like that. What other business is out there that would need someone as deep as you? Is there anything out there, or is this the one that's the cloudiest?
So we've seen these transformations occur in other industries. Take financial services. So imagine that we're on the cusp of where financial services were a decade or two ago, where you had only experts, brokers who understood all these sorts of things, and fund managers who were better than everybody else. There's no data to prove that they actually did anything better. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in all these industries. So you can draw a lot of analogies to what happens in healthcare and what's changed every one of these industries. Access to data. The one thing that has changed, access to data and transactions being commoditized. Anybody can do a transaction. And again, the data dictates your performance. Either you're doing well or you're not. There's no ambiguity on it. Either a drug is helpful or it's not. There's no ambiguity. An FDA approval or a committee of people, for example, like the NCN guidelines or the cancer guidelines, for example. A lot of those people on those committees are compensated by pharma. How can you have a fair guideline, for example, that you have economically interested parties for part of it? And if you're like, how far does this economic interest go? If you're an academician today in academic medicine, what's your most common medical intervention? Drugs. If you ever are on a trial and you say this drug doesn't work, how many trials will you ever be on in the future? So imagine that as physicians and people who are in research, you also have and then academic medical centers, what's their number one thing they sell? Hope. What is hope? Hope isn't about data. Hope is actually about, hey, if you come here, we do research on many things. We're 100% pro research. We think that's where new developments come from. We treat it as a research. If you need a drug and it's someone else's research, and they're the ones who make the big bucks when that drug gets approved, they should pay for the research, or you should own the rights for it. It can't be that you own the rights for paying for it and they own the rights for IP. It doesn't make any sense. In today's world, that's where we are.
I had this guest on the show a couple years ago, and I asked him a similar question. He said the closest this got was back in the 80s with Milken and all this stuff, and the government had to step in because the companies that were the wealth advisors were basically writing the magazines to tell people that these are great things and stuff.
It's the same thing.
And he said, that is nothing compared to the smoke and mirrors of this industry.
Yeah, it is so much. We're one of the 2 countries that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. You're doing consumer advertising on a product that a consumer cannot purchase. Remember, only a physician can prescribe. A consumer can't purchase anything. What country allows advertising to somebody who can't buy something? Think about how crazy that is. It breaks what advertising is unless it's being done for something completely different reasons.
All right, Pramod, let me get some questions in here. How big's your company?
We're about 60 to 70 people.
Do you like being the CEO?
Love it. Love working on this problem. And I chose to do this. It's one of the hardest problems I've ever worked on for all the other businesses that I've done. And it's because it's a very hard problem. All the issues that we've talked about, but it's worth it, right? I've got 3 kids, and there's no reason that their future needs to be that we spend 20% of our GDP unnecessarily on healthcare and call that a good thing. All it's doing is ruining our next few generations. And so it's wrong. It's morally reprehensible for us to stand by the sidelines and say, this is okay. It's not okay. One thing I would recommend to every listener, next time you go see your physician, don't ask them for their opinion. Ask them to show you the data. Ask them to show you the data behind why they're making a decision and why that's the right drug for you and why all of those things. And ask them, what are all the things that you've compared it to? And tell me why out of all of those things, this is the best option for me. Ask them to explain every one of those things to you.
Are they going to hem and haw because they know that they're under the claw of the vertical integration with the formularies?
It could be. Their answer could be as simple as, hey, it has nothing to do with someone else's formulary. That could be an answer. It could be that I don't know these details because I haven't compared them. It could be all of the above, but it starts with consumers requiring data behind the decisions rather than just tell me your opinion.
In a pressed world for time and resources, most professionals don't just offer up everything they know. When someone asks, then they're put on the spot to answer those kind of things. So it starts with a question.
Yeah, and ask specific questions. Don't ask general questions that are answered by television advertising. Ask those specific questions about, hey, what specifically and how have you compared these drugs and what specifically about my data indicates that this is the most cost-effective therapy for me.
Pramod, boy, thanks for joining us. There's a lot of talk going on about theories, but it's really cool when somebody keeps forcing the issue of data and data and data with the ultimate goal of having grandma around to take her to the zoo.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks, Mike, for the chance to speak to your listeners. Really appreciate it. And hopefully they've learned something that they can use practically in their everyday lives.
All right, Pramod, we'll keep in touch.
Thanks, Mike.
You've been listening to the Business of Pharmacy podcast with me, your host, Mike Kelzer. Please subscribe for all future episodes.